Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our third Succession Legal webinar with Dave Singh and the rest of our team. Today, we will be covering the topic of my spouse just died. What do I do? Now, we know that this is, a circumstance that everybody has to deal with from one time or another. And nobody really knows what the correct steps are, depending on the situation. So we would like our attorney, Dave, to go ahead and shed some light on, what these people should do when they're faced with this matter.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Gavin. So this is a call that we get a lot. And, often what we have is a client will call, my husband, my wife, my spouse just passed away. What do I need to do? Can I come in and see you? Right? Those are some of the first questions. Obviously it's a very difficult time emotionally, and people that we speak with, understandably, they have the instinct that there are some things that should happen legally at that time. And so one of the first things that we do, part of our analysis, is when did the spouse actually pass away? And sometimes we'll get a call literally the week of someone passing away, sometimes even sooner than that. And so our first step is to really kind of pump the brakes and have a conversation with the client that, look, nothing that needs to happen at this very moment. It's something that can typically wait for at least a few weeks. And so that allows the client to take care of the final arrangements, take care of, so they'll go through that grieving process, be with their family. And then when it's a good time, when things have calmed down a little bit, then we'll sit down and kind of go through the legal steps. So that's kind of the first step for us, is identifying where are we at in the process. Now, assuming that a client is basically calling us and a sufficient time has passed since their spouse has passed away, if there's been enough time, in our opinion, that it's a good time to now sit with them, one of the first things that we're asking is what existing estate planning was in place. So, why are we having this conversation? Is there a trust? Was there a will? What kind of property did you own with your spouse? And so getting an initial sense of what those assets are and how they were held. And then also, just as importantly, maybe more importantly, is what are the family dynamics that are involved as well. Do we have adult children, minor children? Do we have stepchildren? Do we have, blended family situations, etc.? Do we have, do we have elderly, grandparents or parents that are being taken care of? What are the dynamics here? What are the kind of the motivating factors that are going on? So those are outside of the money and the finance. Now, one of the reasons that clients will call in those early days is, unfortunately, we see this situation more often than we would like, is that one spouse took care of all the finances, and they kind of had all of that under control. They have all the passwords to the banking. They have, they're paying the mortgage, they're paying the bills, they have the access to the savings account. They even know where all the accounts are, which the other spouse may not know. And so in that circumstance, we usually get a pretty panicked call from the client. And so that's one area where we may bring a client in earlier and see if there's ways that we can assist, or at least schedule an initial call with them to figure out what the dynamics are and what's going on. So once we have that initial call, and whether that's happening very soon after someone passes away, or it's happening a few weeks, to give some time for those final arrangements and the funeral, etc. Regardless, one of the things that we need to figure out is what are those assets, and then how are they held, like I said. And so what comes from that conversation sometimes is that there was a trust that was in place. And so that trust actually is going to it's going to go one way or another. So either that trust is going to do its job, or there's an issue with the way that trust was set up, or maybe assets weren't put into the trust, something that occurred that is not going to allow that trust to do its job. And so when we're sitting with a client, we have that ability to kind of assess that situation. And if the trust is in place and it's going to do its job, what we mean is that the administration typically, right? So like 80%, maybe even 90% of the time, there's not much of an administration that needs to happen after the first spouse passes away. There are some minor things, some buttoning up of things that have to happen, maybe some allocations within the trust. I won't get into those details, but it's pretty minor compared to a full-blown trust administration. So a trust doing its job for most clients is not going to require a lot of work when the first spouse passes away. So things stay pretty steady. Now, a trust not doing its job, and that could be for various reasons, that is where there could be some work. So some of the situations that we see are, we have a trust, we didn't put our property into the trust. And let's add another element to that. That property was held in the name of the spouse who passed away only. So it could be a piece of real estate, only had husband's name, and now we're meeting with wife, husband has passed away. Now what do we do? So, wife in that situation doesn't have the ability to transfer that property into the trust. Actually, the wife in that situation doesn't have the ability to do really anything with that property because her name is not on that property. So now we have a breakage in the link between what the intentions were and what the reality is. And so that's where we would talk about certain things like a spousal property petition, potentially a probate as well. Both of those happen within the probate court, but these are two proceedings that we would look at to create a link between the reality, which is there's a piece of property, and the intentions, which is that we want that property to go to the spouse. If there is a trust, we may look at a Hegstead petition as well, which is another proceeding that happens in probate court, again, to bring property over into the trust. And so these are some of the things that can arise when we have a spouse who's passed away, and if there are kind of inconsistencies in the way that property was held at that time of death.
All right, understood. You did mention something right at the beginning. You said, if sufficient amount of time has passed that you feel, then you would be happy to sit down with the potential client and see where you could step in and help. What's generally like a sufficient amount of time when it comes to things like this? Is there a timeline or is there a time frame? And legally,
Mhm.
is there, a structure and order that things need to be done in?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great question. It's a common question that we get as well. So within 60 days of the date of death is kind of the critical piece for us. And we really want to sit with a client within about 30 to 45 days of the date of death. The reason is depending on what assets they hold, and then also how they held those assets. If there is a trust in place, there may be duties that they have within 60 days of the date of death. And so, and they're also, if there's real estate involved, we have property tax forms that may need to be filed. There are timelines that do apply, and typically, nothing really applies within 30 days, but certainly by the time you hit 60 days, then we have some timelines that are starting to hit. So.
Got it. Okay. All right. And I do want to, leave this time open right now. You gave us so much information. If there are any other questions that anybody else has, now is the time, Dave's happy to answer them.
Absolutely. And then I will say too, before we jump into any questions. So the key thing here, and the way that we approach it as a firm, is that this is really one of those situations where there's a lot of uncertainty, right? And so a spouse, will have, maybe they created a estate plan, maybe they didn't, right? So maybe there's a trust and maybe a will in place, or maybe we're just in what we call a blank slate environment. We don't have any plan in place, or no documents that we can reference. That in itself, and even clients who have plans they can feel a lot of uncertainty, because they may say, you know what, we did create this plan 15, 20 years ago. We never revisited it. And then now my spouse has passed away, and I don't know if what we decided 15, 20 years ago is what I would want to happen now.
Yeah.
And so part of sitting down and having that initial discussion is looking at what's in place, and doesn't line up with what the intentions were. And sometimes we are able to bring those two in, in line, right? By working with the surviving spouse to adjust the existing plan or even potentially create a new plan. Sometimes we have the ability to do that, but sometimes we don't. And so that's difficult news to, to present to a client, of course. But it's important that they understand that. One of the things, especially when we're working with clients who have a blended family, and they have, we have stepchildren involved and things like that. One of the things we really caution our clients about is doing anything too quickly right at that beginning stage, or distributing property. There's like an instinct to, okay, I'm just going to I'm going to, move this property here, or I'm going to take this now and I'm going to give this, vehicle to this child, and things like that. Things like this start to happen in that moment because things are very emotional and everything feels urgent, but it's not really, you know. And so we need to get clients to really pump the brakes on what they're doing, at least from the asset, perspective, especially in blended family situations, which is really common. Obviously, we have a lot of blended families that we work with, but even, non-blended families, traditional families, we can have family dynamics that would, warrant just pumping the brakes, keeping everything steady for a moment, until we get to the phase where we're able to put a plan together and then get to that, distribution. It could be distribution, could be nothing, right? Well, like I said, there may be nothing that needs to be done at that point. Many of our clients, that's the case. So it's one of those situations where what's really important is to do the work on the front end, do the assessment with the client, get an understanding of what the moving parts are, and then we start moving.
All right, awesome. Yeah, thank you for all that information. It does not seem like we have any other questions, but I do want to say, I look forward to, our future webinars. You covered a lot of, if the client comes to you, with their spouse passed away, and, there were plans in place, what I would like to hear you discuss, and, we'll cover it in future webinars, is what happens when there weren't any plans
Mm-hmm.
in place, and also we know, death is a hard subject to talk about. I'm sure, there's a lot of couples that haven't even had that conversation about what to do, so yeah, and I know you have a lot of exposure, in this field, so we would love to hear a lot more about, what you have to say in regards to those areas as well. So thank you, Dave, for your time and
Yeah,
great information.
absolutely. Thanks a lot.